I've learned to say in the 3 years since retirement that I'm the artist formerly known as General Holmes. If you get that joke. Now operating out, in the world with everyone else, I enjoy my association with Air Force Historical Foundation. You may have joined us for one of our book club evenings or one of our war story evenings, and if not, I hope you'll take a look on our site and see those events that are there. Like a lot of organizations with long histories, and ours goes back into the 1940s, we every 10 years or so talk about what can we do to become more relevant to a new generation of people without antagonizing the people that have been the basis of our membership. And we're in one of those periods. You will have seen a redone web presence. You'll have seen more content being made available there. You've seen us trying to reach out once a month with some kind of event where we can talk to people instead of just send out something in writing. You've seen us move our journal toward more of a digital format, but to have one big keepsake large format issue every year that we can spread around. We know that many of you are involved in this same kind of place in the world where you have a museum or you have an activity and you need to think about how you get people in there and how you're going to continue to share the lessons of the past to help us prepare. And we look forward to your help and your ideas on how we might do that. I'm particularly grateful that all of you made the trip here, some of you local, some from further. We're excited about getting back in the symposium business. This is a first step for us, and again, we'll be happy to take your input and advice on how we're doing here and what we can do in the future to serve this population better. But welcome to our Museums Conference and Awards Weekend. I think you'll find it a unique gathering of presenters and topics to examine the end of the American involvement in Vietnam 50 years ago. From artifacts to misty facts, from medicine to warrior poets, there's something for everyone to explore this weekend. I was talking to some guys last night. The squadron that I joined, I was commissioned in 1981. I joined my first F-15 squadron in 1983. The leadership of the squadron, the top three as we call them, the commander, the DO, and the assistant DO, didn't have 500 hours of F-15 time between them. So we're in a new world where we were flying F-15s and F-16s, and our leadership didn't know anything about flying those particular airplanes, but they knew about going to war and preparing for war, and they had a list of things that they wanted to fix based on their experience going to war and preparing for war. And so we learned how to fly those airplanes together, but they taught us how to think about approaching what we were doing. There's a lot written about the impact of the Vietnam generation on building that military that I was a part of, but I do feel a personal connection to the folks that fought that war because of, not the least of which, because of what they passed on to my generation and the things that we worked through. We're in an interesting time now where after 20 years of being involved in fighting violent extremists, where air power was absolutely critical to what we were doing. My friend, Mark Milley, we spent a year together in Afghanistan, and I heard Mark tell a visiting Army general who was the CENTCOM J3. He said, yeah, the way this works is that we stumble around and find and fix the enemy with infantry forces, and then the Air Force, Mobile's guys come in and kill them. And that's kind of what we did for 2 years of this counterinsurgency war that we were in. Our brothers and sisters on the ground patrolled and ran into people or searched them for them and found them and got into firefights, and they were able to rely on the Air Force to come in and finish that fight or take care of the folks that were endangering them. So those lessons continue. We're going to transition now back into thinking about how to fight peer conflict, and frankly, our Air Force is not used to it. Our Air Force is used to things like I did in Afghanistan, where I flew around for a year, and the biggest risk to me personally was flying into the side of a mountain in the weather, not what an enemy could do to me. We lost very few airmen in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. When we did, it was mostly our own fault for the things that we did, and we have to prepare a new generation for things like our Vietnam mentors knew where one guy in 10 didn't come back, and 10 of your squadron mates were prisoners in Hanoi by the end of your tour, and how to think about going back out day after day and what's different about that. And so we'll rely on the people that remember those lessons to help us learn them. We'll have our 2 days of events here, and I'm proud of them. Monday night, we'll also celebrate our Literary Award winners and present the I.B. Holly Award for Lifetime Achievement in the documentation and dissemination of U.S. Air Force history to Phil Meilinger. We're happy that he could be here with us. That'll be a memorable affair, including a celebration of the establishment of the U.S. Air Force some 76 years ago. But to kick off this weekend, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Larry Berman. Larry Berman, PhD, Princeton University, is Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Davis. His books include Zumwalt, The Life and Times of Admiral Elmo Russell Bud Zumwalt Jr., Perfect Spy, The Incredible Double Life of Pham Xuan, Time Magazine reporter and Vietnamese communist agent, No Peace, No Honor, Nixon, Kissinger, and Betrayal in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson's War, The Road to Stalemate in Vietnam, and Planning a Tragedy, The Americanization of the War in Vietnam. Berman is currently writing his next book, A Slow Walk with Death, The Lingering Legacy of Agent Orange. Professor Berman's work has been featured on C-SPAN's Book TV and Afterwards, the History Channel's Secrets of War, Bill Moyer's The Public Mind, David McCullough's American Experience, and Vietnam, A Television History. He served on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund Content Advisory Committee for the Education Center at the Wall Project. He's a frequent speaker at Vietnam veterans events and reunions. He's been an invited speaker at the Air Force Academy, the Air War College West Point, the Naval Academy, and the National War College. He's received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council for Learned Societies. He also received the Bernath Lecture Prize given annually by the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations to a scholar whose work has most contributed to our understanding of foreign relations. He's been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and a scholar in residence at the Rockefeller Foundation Center in Bellagio, Italy. Dr. Berman's recipient of the highest career honor bestowed by UC Davis Academic Senate, the Faculty Research Lecturer Award. His talk, 50 Years On in Vietnam, A Bad Ending with a Better Beginning, is sure to set the stage for a fantastic gathering, and at tremendous personal effort, because all of us have things going on in our life besides the events that we plan. He made tremendous effort to be here and join us this morning. So let's please give a warm welcome to Larry Berman. Thank you, sir. Pleasure.
Thank you. You know, it's said that the closest we ever come to perfection is when someone requests a bio to be introduced so they could introduce you. So don't be misled by that. Although I think I'm going to save it for my obituary. It sounded really good. But on that, so I'm delighted to be here this morning, and I especially want to thank my dear friend Mark Clodfelter, who is known by many of you here, who recommended me to Dick that I could speak because he couldn't be here today, and it's tough. You know, Claude's a tough act to fill, but I'm going to try to do it today. My remarks this morning reflect on the war, its ending for the American side, the aftermath at home as well as in Vietnam, the war's lingering legacies, and finally the relationship today between former enemies. Now, in preparing my remarks today, I did so with the understanding that this is an audience of varied interests, ranging from museum handling of Vietnam artifacts, Vietnam-related topics from medicine to biography, and AFHF programs. And so I didn't want to just dig into one thing and bore you all to death, so I'm going to try to bore you all to death with a lot of broad things. Each one of these topics interests me. My service on the Content Advisory Committee for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Foundation proposed Education Center at the Wall, as well as my work, very close work, with the Vietnam Archive at Texas Tech and its virtual archive have given me a great appreciation for museum and archival issues. At a later time, if anyone is ever interested, I have a presentation and a PowerPoint on the proposed education center at the Wall. That project's not going to happen because of funding. It's really tragic that it's not going to happen, but we spent 4 years working on that, and but the funding just couldn't be raised. So even though the National Park Service and everyone had created a spot for it, and a lot of time and effort went in, but right now it's just a PowerPoint on that. It's a really sad story in a way. As a historian of the war, I've worked in every presidential library and numerous archives around the world, so I'm interested in archival material. I've also visited just about every war museum and battlefield site in Vietnam. Last month I made my 52nd trip to Vietnam since the year 2000. My favorite, for those of you who are museum people, my favorite museum in Vietnam is the Ho Chi Minh Trail Museum just outside of Hanoi. If you ever have a chance to go there, or you want to look at a museum that's really fascinating, which includes all the artifacts that the Vietnamese communists found on the trail, which sadly includes many Air Force material. It's a fascinating museum with very little of the hype that the big museums have. And it's about 20 clicks out of Hanoi, easy to get to, the Ho Chi Minh Trail Museum.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Is there interpretations there in English?
You can hire someone to do that, yes. And there was when I was there, but you can definitely hire someone from your hotel or anything to take you there, because even to get there, you'd need to hire a driver, and your hotel would suggest that you also hire an interpreter as well. Yeah, but it's really a worthwhile visit. As for the Vietnam War history, my first book on the war appeared in 1982, and I'm still at it, as you just heard. To measure how long I've been doing this stuff, I always carry this around. This is the 14th Military History Symposium, United States Air Force Academy, Vietnam, 1964 to 1973, an American Dilemma. That was in October 17th through 19th of 1990. Now, the good thing, well, you could have actually called, the title of my talk could have been this, and right, the good news is I've learned a lot. And secondly, I promise you I have not recycled my lecture notes from the Air Force Academy in 1990. This is brand new, and it's now 50 years since the American withdrawal, often recalled by the iconic photo of a rooftop helicopter evacuation. 48 years since reunification in 1975, often recalled by another iconic photo of a North Vietnamese tank barreling through the gates of what was then known as the Presidential Palace, today renamed Independence Palace. It's 27 years since normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam. 10 years now of a comprehensive partnership between Vietnam and the United States. Recently, last week, elevated to the comprehensive strategic partnership level, reminding us that Vietnam is today a country, not so much a war. I'll have a lot more to say about this in my closing remarks. The situation today stands in stark contrast to the one that prevailed in earlier decades, when bilateral relations remained mired in mutual suspicion and hostility, even as the two sides tried to discuss some critical issues like MIAs, refugees, and reconstruction aid. Much old war wariness lingered, and there was little sign of the far-reaching changes in the relationship that lay ahead. Let me just give you, because of where I am and because of so many people in the audience, let me give you just one example of this new relationship. Vietnamese pilots today are now part of you probably all know this, but I didn't. Vietnamese pilots are now part of a 52-week aviation leadership program at Columbia Air Force Base, an Air Force scholarship program that provides pilot training to select officers from other nations' air forces, but also helps to build relationships between future leaders of air forces and cooperation between countries. I was unaware of that. But if you think that when we think about the Vietnam War, and here we are training, we offering Vietnamese pilots the opportunity to come here and study and learn, is just a tremendous growth in what's happened. But the theme of this weekend is the American exit from Vietnam in 1973. Here I have some painful things to say. The American involvement ostensibly ended in 1973, 60 days after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January of that year. Richard Nixon called it peace with honor, and I'll discuss that in a few minutes. But in truth, and this is the harsh reality, the war would continue between the Vietnamese until April 30th, 1975, when South Vietnam was lost, when we let an ally run out of bullets. A very, very dark period in our memory, which was brought back, obviously, in the last days recently of what happened in Afghanistan. The 1973 Paris Peace Accords made it easy for the Americans to turn away from a war. They were tired of the war. Once the POWs and the soldiers returned home, it was no longer America's war. The fact is, when the corpses changed colors, Americans' interest diminished. It was now a Vietnamese war, and not a moment of peace came to Vietnam for a long time. I hope some of you will be interested, and you could reach out to me very easy. I'm organizing a conference. I'm a consultant. I work for the USS Midway. It was in my, well, I forgot to put it in that beautiful bio you read. I better just revise that again, make sure it's in that obit. But I work for the USS Midway Museum, which in San Diego, and we are planning an April 1975 commemoration conference that will commemorate the end of the official end of that conflict. And if those of you who have not been at the Midway Museum would find it particularly interesting as well, because it's obviously the most visited and iconic place for tourists to go in San Diego. And we'll be focusing on the fact that the U.S. evacuated an estimated 125,000 Vietnamese refugees, many of whom have resettled successfully in the United States and have created vibrant pockets of Vietnamese communities across America. But those who could not evacuate were subjected to re-education. And for those who worked closely with the United States, it was retribution and incarceration. Years and years of pain to endure for being an ally to the United States and what happened afterwards. That conference will occur in 2025.
Sir?
Yes.
Will you have the Vietnamese major who landed the O-1 on the Keynote?
We're going to try reaching out to all of them. As a matter of fact, we're trying to match up the families who were rescued at the time. Now, many of them have passed away, but the children are alive, with the pilots who brought them aboard, because there was a matching program where the pilots were instructed to stay with those families until then they were off-listed from the Midway. So we're trying to do all those human. As a matter of fact, the first planning meeting for this conference is Monday. It's a Zoom meeting with the 5 or 6 major organizers. So I'm looking with the Midway. So we're doing it with Texas Tech as well. So yes, we will. And so thank you for asking that. Even today, it's difficult to fathom the level of death and destruction, the maimed and the wounded, wrought in a country roughly the size of California. Those who served did not return to parades or national acclaim. Their reception reflected America's attempt to cast aside, to separate itself from the war in what I've called a collective amnesia. No one wanted to talk about it, write about it, think about it from 1975 to 1985. I mean, we got our ass kicked and we didn't know how to deal with that. Amnesia and always controversy. Now, it's not the same anymore, but controversy throughout. The Vietnam War Memorial is the best example of this. It's now the second most visited tourist attraction in the capital after the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. Many come for personal reasons, but no visitor can escape the sense of despair, contradiction, and senselessness of the Vietnam conflict that is captured in the black granite wall below ground level. But there was controversy. In 1984, the 3 soldiers statue was added a few feet from the wall to complement it and offer an alternative memorial for critics who disliked the non-traditional design of the wall, often referred to by veterans as Jane Fonda's ditch or a one-ton condolence card. And the 3 soldiers represent the diversity of the U.S. military by including a Caucasian, African American, and Latino American whose service branch is intentionally ambiguous. Together, they face the wall of the fallen. Today, hundreds of privately financed memorials have been built throughout the United States to honor Vietnam veterans. The traveling wall, known as the Wall That Heals, tours the country. I had the honor to bring it to UC Davis for 1 week, and it was just one of the most moving experiences as students, young people, 18, 19, 20, 21, have a chance to see this moving wall. I saw it at Texas Tech as well, and if you go on the website for the Vietnam Memorial Foundation, you can see the schedule for where that wall will be this coming year. But back to 1973, 50 years ago, the plenary peace talks in Paris began in May 1968 at the old Majestic Hotel and ended on January 27, 1973 at the International Center with the signing of the agreement on ending the war and restoring the peace. This is the peace was negotiated almost as long as the war was fought, and has earned the name the War for Peace because of how long it took to negotiate the peace. In January 1973, which is what I want to address, in a nationally televised address, President Nixon insisted that this agreement had achieved peace with honor by including the cessation of all hostilities and the withdrawal of American troops. The United States agreed to halt all air and naval actions against North Vietnam and dismantle and deactivate all mines in Vietnam waters. Within 60 days after the signing of the agreement, all United States forces, as well as foreign forces of all allied nations, would withdraw from Vietnam. The United States was specifically prohibited from introducing new war materials or supplies to Vietnam, and they were required to dismantle all military bases in South Vietnam. The agreement called for the return of all captured military personnel and foreign civilians during the same 60-day period. The United States and North Vietnam pledged to respect the principle of self-determination of the South Vietnamese people. I'll tell you right now, the ending of this, no one gave a damn about the self-determination of the South Vietnamese people. And I'm preempting myself, but I just get so emotional sometimes, including free and democratic elections under international supervision. Most important, the 2 armies, the 2 armed forces of the 2 Vietnamese parties were allowed to remain in place with the same restrictions on the introduction of war materials. So that meant that the North Vietnamese army was allowed to remain in place in the South in what is called a leopard spot solution. The reason for that, I'll explain momentarily. Now, that's what Nixon said. In 1973, the North Vietnamese heralded this agreement as a great victory. The United States had pledged to support Vietnam's independence, sovereignty, reunification, and territorial integrity. The text of this accord was read continuously for 5 days and 5 nights over Radio Hanoi. Hanoi's streets were filled with crowds of people in celebration because in 60 days, there would no longer be any foreign troops in Vietnam. The Vietnamese had done this with the French, the Japanese, and now the Americans. The future of Vietnam was going to be determined by the Vietnamese, not by an outside intervening force. Only in South Vietnam was there no joy or celebration. North Vietnam's army had been permitted to remain in the South Vietnam. Now, in 1969, when the negotiations started, the balance of forces in the South was in favor of the United States. And there were 520,000 American troops. And Hanoi therefore had no intention of making a deal because Nixon had already announced Vietnamization, the gradual withdrawal of American troops. Hanoi had no incentive whatsoever, as Nixon had pledged the turning over the war to the South Vietnamese and withdrawing the Americans. Hanoi just stalled in the secret negotiations and the public negotiations, making demands that they knew Kissinger could never accept, the primary one being that President Nguyen Van Thu of South Vietnam remain in power, that he would have to be removed, because Nixon always believed the way we got into Vietnam was that there was no way out after Kennedy had sanctioned the coup, had authorized the coup, had approved the coup against President Diem. Once you authorize that coup, you own it, is what Nixon thought, and I would agree with that. And he didn't want to leave Vietnam by overthrowing another government. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to overthrow Diem. He didn't want to be part of the Diem thing, and he didn't want to be part of overthrowing President Thu. The Paris Accords was a suicide pact for South Vietnam. We now know that in the secret negotiations, Henry Kissinger very early abandoned the U.S. position of mutual withdrawal. Most of the public thought there was going to be a mutual withdrawal, but he abandoned it in favor of unilateral withdrawal of American troops. He accepted the ceasefire in place, and most important, he accepted that no residual force would be left behind, as we did in Korea. President Nguyen Van Thu would remain in power, and the political future of Vietnam would be determined in free elections by the Vietnamese parties that neither side believed would ever be held, because both sides all sides remembered Geneva of 1954, which promised those elections in 1956, and they never occurred. We now know that in 1973, President Nixon pledged secretly in letters to President Thu that the B-52s would return when the treaty was violated. That's how he got President Thu to agree to this. He was going to bring back the B-52s. We have those letters. And you know better than I, that the Christmas bombing and the bombing in December of 1972 had created fear in the Vietnamese. It had brought them back to the table in January of 1973. Nixon, although today if you go to Vietnam, you can go to a place called the Avenue of the B-52s, where the Vietnamese have purposely left one home, never to be rebuilt again. It's called the Avenue of the B-52s to show what collateral damage looked like. They did the same at Bach Mai Hospital as well. Thu had no doubt, Nixon had no doubt, Kissinger had no doubt that the Vietnamese would violate the treaty. And when they did, they would bring the B-52s back and punish them, because Nixon was determined that by 1976, when his term ended, there would be a South Vietnam on the books. He could not afford, with these great successes with China and the Soviet Union, he was not going to lose South Vietnam, a country that successive American presidents before him had pledged to defend. As early as March of 1973, Kissinger recommended to Nixon airstrikes at Khe Sanh. Nixon planned to honor his pledges to defend South Vietnam with air power through 1976. He called this, or I call this, permanent war. Some scholars maintain that the Paris Peace Accords were context for merely a decent interval between an American withdrawal and South Vietnam's defeat. Nixon's tapes provide some evidence for this, but whether you believe the permanent war or the decent interval, it really doesn't matter. Neither is charitable to Nixon or Kissinger. Watergate and Vietnam would be inexorably linked. On April 30th, 1973, less than 4 months after the Accords, Nixon told the country he accepted the responsibility for Watergate, the indigenous forces to resist transformation by an external intervening power. Vietnam demonstrated the dominance of local conditions, the importance of cultural and historical knowledge, the indispensability of client regime legitimacy, and the American public's intolerance of protracted wars in other countries' civil war, no matter how noble our intent. Our adversaries in Vietnam suffered and endured extraordinary losses and hardships, years on the front separated from their families. Their resilience came not from some blind orthodoxy of adherence to communism or socialism, but from the belief that their country had been occupied by foreigners. Our failure was to understand that the South Vietnamese required building popular support for the regime in the South. It involved something we really didn't do, helping the non-communist Vietnamese take back their national political aspiration by developing a political cause worth fighting for and dying for beyond fear of communism. But the very idea that the Vietnamese might be a serious challenge to the insurgency on political grounds was never in the mindset of the Americans who planned the war. Many of the factors that made Vietnam a quagmire, weakness and insularity of our local ally, corruption, controlling borders, isolating the battlefield, our adversaries' reliance on sanctuaries, the impact of our military presence on the local insurgency, were later replicated in Afghanistan, where the only counter-escalation open to our adversary was broadening their insurgent base. The United States hoped to achieve in Iraq and Afghanistan what it failed to do in Vietnam, create and sustain a government and political order that would be supported and fought for by its populace. A reasonable person should have asked why, and now everyone asks why, were the Taliban able to come back, having been reviled by most of the country? Could their support have been related to the number of U.S. troops fighting on their soil? Can foreign troops provide locals the motivation to fight against their countrymen for a national power? I'll leave these questions to National War College and elsewhere, but these are important questions, I think, that need to be discussed, and I know are being discussed. Back to 1973. In 1973, the winning side emerged from the war in an economically and militarily weak position. The United States imposed a full trade embargo and cut off all aid. The United States was the Soviet Union was Vietnam's only real ally. There were no diplomatic relations with China or other Southeast Asia countries. Vietnam became one of the poorest countries on earth during the subsidy period of rations, coupons, lack of necessities. This period of what we call Soviet collectivism precipitated a major refugee crisis symbolized by the boat people exodus from Vietnam. Between 1975 and 1990, 1 million people escaped Vietnam, many to the United States. Only 4 years later, Vietnam invaded and occupied neighboring Cambodia, which was under the control of the Chinese-backed Khmer regime, and then China invaded Vietnam. Who would have thought that something like that could have occurred, precipitating the Third Indochina War? The winning side, North Vietnam, suffered 2 million civilian deaths and 1 million military deaths, and still grapples today with war legacies like dioxin poison and unexploded ordnance. 300,000 Vietnamese on both sides, South and North, are still missing, unaccounted for, referred to as wandering souls, destined to wander the earth forever, if not identified, remaining martyrs until entombed. That is why such great efforts have been made to try to identify these people. In 1988, Hanoi allowed American searches for missing in action personnel across all Vietnamese territories, which led to the establishment of the Missing in Action Affairs Office in 1991. This was the first official presence in Vietnam since 1975. In 1992, the Full Accounting Task Force was created. Today, the work is being done by the POW-MIA Accounting Agency. One of my former students is a lead person in this. In 2015, the United States Congress approved the Unidentified Remains Project. Those of you who are interested in archival work and museums, this project, you should take a look at what they're doing. The USAID has provided $1 million for the creation of a database to help identify the missing in Vietnam, both South and Northern people. American families and veterans, you heard I'm writing a book on Agent Orange, and it's probably the saddest book I've ever written. American veterans and their families were not the only ones to suffer the time bomb of Agent Orange poisoning, described by one veteran to me as, "We will always live with what we killed in Vietnam." The legacy of Agent Orange and dioxin continues to haunt the Vietnamese in terms of ill health, shortened lives, birth defects, and poisoned landscapes. The dispersion of Agent Orange over vast areas of Central and South Vietnam poisoned the soil, river systems, lakes, and rice paddies of Vietnam, enabling toxic chemicals to enter the food chain. This has appropriately been called ecocide. The U.S. has now completed, and Operation Ranch Hand, I've interviewed many of the Ranch Hand pilots who were instrumental in the first, the deployment of Agent Orange beginning in 1961. The U.S. has now completed a 5-year program to clean the soil contaminated by Agent Orange at Da Nang Air Base. For 4 decades, the Da Nang airport was a health hazard to thousands of people living there. There were hot spots all over. You couldn't go there. It is now free of dioxin. The cleanup of Ben Hoa is 4 times larger than Da Nang and expected to cost $400 million. Blood samples from Ben Hoa revealed extremely elevated dioxin levels, up to 271 parts per billion, more than 4 times the level of contamination at Love Canal. Had these levels of contamination been found in the United States, the site would have been immediately bulldozed and its residents forced to evacuate the area. The contaminated soil is a serious problem in Vietnam. It's everywhere. Another remnant of war issue involves landmines and unexploded ordnance. President George H.W. Bush was the first president who agreed to provide prosthetics and wheelchairs to Vietnamese who were disabled by landmines and other exploded ordnances. Since then, the United States has helped locate and destroy the millions of landmines and cluster bombs that continue to maim and kill innocent Vietnamese. Thanks to the efforts of Project Renew, which you could look at their website, and other NGOs, the number of casualties today is far fewer than it used to be, but more remains to be done. Let me just wrap this up by saying that the better beginning part. Eventually, once all the fighting ended, not only with the Americans, but with the Chinese, and the Vietnamese leaders took stock of their basket case economy in 1981, 82, 83, 84, the decision was made to undertake or shift gears to Des Moines, which is renovation or economic change, opening up Vietnam to foreign investment. Vietnam's transition from a centrally planned to a market economy transformed the country, spurring rapid economic growth, moving Vietnam today from one of the world's poorest countries to lower middle income country. Those looking for evidence that we might have won the war, I'll tell you where you can find it: the long lines in Saigon and Hanoi to go into McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. Right? The fact of the matter is, we're going to kill them all eventually. That crossover point is going to be related to coronary heart disease, okay? They'd rather eat Kentucky Fried Chicken and burgers, Big Macs, than pho, okay? So, and that is the truth. You got to see it to believe it, but it's true. Today, Vietnam is one of the stars of the emerging market universe, a hub for foreign investment and manufacturing in Southeast Asia. Japanese and Korean electronic companies, Samsung, LG, Olympus, Pioneer, countless European American apparel makers are there. They have factories there. Foreign direct investment in manufacturing is extraordinary. And half the Nike footwear sold in the world is made in Vietnam. Since the early 2000s, bilateral connections in diplomacy, trade, capital investment, education, and cultural exchange have thrived. Today there is collaboration on a wide range of shared interests: trade, clean energy transition, climate change initiatives, public health, dioxin cleanup, Mekong Delta water issues, South China Sea security, as well as joint efforts to clear unexploded ordnance and cleanup of dioxin hotspots. Also notable, which I don't have time to talk about, is Vietnam's emergence in ASEAN and on the world stage. Vietnam now has a seat on the United Nations Security Council as a permanent non-member. How did all this happen? Very simply. The end of the Cold War changed the strategic environment in which both Vietnam and the United States viewed each other. The collapse of socialist regimes in Central Europe and later the Soviet Union created an international environment facilitating the development of relations. In 1995, President Clinton normalized relations, lifted the trade embargo, pledging to clean up landmines. Since then, every American president has gone to Vietnam. Clinton's visit was remarkable. President Clinton's visit was remarkable because the Vietnamese started lining in 2000. They started lining up at 4 in the morning to see them. All the young people. You know, Vietnam's a remarkably young country. 70% of Vietnamese in Vietnam today were born after the war. It's a remarkably young country. And all of these students, not all the 70%, lined the streets of some 30 miles just to see Clinton. Not Clinton the man or Clinton the person, for what he stood for. Prosperity, opportunity, freedom. That's why so many Vietnamese want to study in the United States, want to study in Great Britain and Australia, to be exposed to these ideas. Defense ties between the former foes have been building since Obama lifted the embargo on the sale of weapons to Vietnam in 2016. In 2017, we began trading with Vietnam, giving them U.S. Hamilton-class Coast Guard cutters transferred to Vietnam to help them in their security interests. And in 2018, the USS Carl Vinson, our aircraft carrier, made the historic port call in Da Nang. It was the first U.S. aircraft carrier to visit Vietnam since the end of the war. Everyone was always scared that some old Vietnamese guy who hadn't had any communication would see the U.S. aircraft carrier come running out and thought he was supposed to shoot it or something. And as reflected in President Biden's recent visit to Vietnam, relations have been highly focused on shared defense and security interests in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as economics. For those of you who have not seen President Biden went, I'm closing here, as President Biden went to go see the last part of his trip in Vietnam, he went to go see the marker for John McCain. And those of you who have not noticed it, I guess it's a win for the Air Force because, of course, he was a naval aviator, but the Vietnamese didn't know that, so the marker is next to the lake where he was fished out, and every year a big thing is made out of it. But on the marker, it just identifies him as being a member of the United States Air Force. So I don't know, depending upon your political proclivity, you could either like it or not. But I always get a kick out of it. Finally, I want to just thank you all for listening. To close, during the welcome ceremony in Vietnam for President Biden's visit, General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong said that Vietnam and the United States, and I quote exactly here, cooperated to fight fascism during World War II. That, of course, is true. He was referring to 1945, when members of the DEER team from the USS Office of Strategic Services had worked with and worked closely with Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh forces to fight a common enemy, the Japanese. 2.4 million Vietnamese dead, over 58,000 Americans dead, and all the other damages that I've talked about. And we finally are doing what Ho Chi Minh asked for in 1945. We are partners working together against common threats. To me, this is the best of all better beginnings from such a sad or such a bad ending in 1973. Thank you. Thank you.